Okay, well, thank you, Richard, and thanks everybody for coming along and listening to this talk tonight. Well, the castles of William Marshal, Earl of Pembroke, and his sons show a number of signature design themes. In trying to explain them, a number of authorities have argued for inspiration from the works of the French king, Philip II, Augustus. But I will argue that while Marshal's influences did come from France, they came instead from castles that were built there by the English kings, of whom Marshal was a close companion for most of his life. Suggested influence from the French court, on the other hand, fits in with neither form, function, political circumstance, nor chronology. Marshal held a number of castles in Britain, including Pembroke and Kilgarran in Pembrokeshire, Usk, Chepstow and Caerleon in Monmouthshire, Goodrich in Herefordshire, and Kilkenny and Carlow in Ireland. Most of them show some work by Marshal, but the extent of that work is much debated. Pembroke is chiefly known for its magnificent cylindrical donjon here, which almost certainly was built by Marshal, along with the great round tower at Kilkenny and the similar, though much smaller, garrison tower at Usk, and the middle and upper wards at Chepstow. But other work is perhaps more likely to have been by his sons. Of Marshal's castles in France, only Longueville-sur-Sea in Normandy shows any substantial remains. We'll be looking at three main aspects of design: cylindrical great towers, geometric planning, and gateways. As a leading courtier from 1186 onwards, Marshal had intimate experience of Angevin castles, including a number with cylindrical great towers, either in the form of donjons or keeps, or other forms of dominant tower. Both types originated in France, where around half of the 50 or so of these towers that were built before 1204 are now thought to be the work of the Angevin kings or their vassals. They're the red and black dots on this map. This is something that's been long recognized by French authors, but has been slow to be acknowledged in Britain, where there's still a tendency to downplay Angevin round great towers in favor of their square counterparts. The freestanding tower, of plain cylindrical form, appears to have emerged in the Loire region, though it's far from certain which is the earliest. A date around 1100, under an ally of the Angevins, is normally claimed for Fréteval in Loire, but it's also been suggested that as part of the Angevin King Henry II's extensive building campaign of the early 1160s, which is perhaps more persuasive. In Normandy, Henry's cylindrical donjons at Château-Sorette and Neuflet apparently belonged to the same programme and were complete by 1180. While those at Neufmarché and Bourg-le-Roi in Maine may be contemporary. In Touraine, Châtillon-sur-Indre is possibly from the 1180s, where Le Brandon and the Châtelier belong either to Henry's reign or to that of his son, Richard I. Richard continues his father's tradition through the 1190s, for example at Bonneville-sur-Touques, which was the main Angevin seat in Normandy. Also in Normandy, he built round donjons at Cléry and Longchamp, and most famously at Château-Gaillard, though here the donjon is only round on one side. In Poitou, King Richard built this round donjon at Montreuil-Bonnin and converted a truncated square donjon at nearby Scorbay-Clairvaux into a semicircular structure. Cylindrical donjons of the Angevins' vassal lords include Conches-en-Ouche in Normandy, built under royal advocacy between 1180 and 1204, and in Poitou, those at Cluy and Brosse, dated 1190s to 1240s. So quite a few Angevin round towers. And like Pembroke's donjon, they have little in common with the towers built by the French kings and their nobles. French royal towers are often rather complex, with lobes or turrets, while the plain cylinder was not greatly favoured. And while the Counts of Blois, subject to the French kings, were responsible for a dense cluster of relatively straightforward round donjons, the block of yellow dots, these are also of rather different design. Unlike Angevin examples and Pembroke, they're often stone vaulted at every level and can show complex systems of wall chambers and passages, like Chapdelaine here. The freestanding cylindrical donjon, then, was firmly rooted in the works of the Angevin kings. But they don't seem to have built any on this side of the channel, where they instead favoured cylindrical great towers that were attached to the curtain wall. The freestanding donjon was normally not defensive and so lacks arrow loops, and in many cases wasn't residential either, seeming instead to have been primarily ceremonial. In contrast, great towers attached to the curtain had the potential to be defensive, but could be residential as well. The tours mixtes, or mixed towers, of French authors. For example, the Tour du Moulin at Angevin-Chinon in Touraine here, which was probably built by King John in 1200 to 1203, is a cylindrical corner tower pierced for archery, while the 6 large windows in its uppermost floor suggest domestic use as well. King John also built cylindrical tours mixtes in Ireland, where his large record tower at Dublin Castle is arrow-looped, like Chinon. The form was also adopted by the barons in Britain and Ireland, including William Marshal at Usk, and other barons, for example at Barnard Castle in County Durham, which was probably built between 1208 and 1228, and can also be compared with Chinon. But the French King Philip Augustus also built circular tours mixtes. In their developed form, these tours philippiennes, as they're known, were attached to the curtain wall, usually at a corner, and were furnished with arrow loops. Vernon here was begun before 1200, but the majority were built between 1203 and 1223. That is, after the Tour du Moulin in Chinon. So their influence on King John is debatable. And most of their features, their encircling ditches, domestic appointments, and multiple rib vaults, are unknown in Angevin towers, either royal or baronial. Not apparently ceremonial, they were perhaps mainly intended for use by regional officials. Pembroke's donjon, which was probably begun in 1201, may be the earliest freestanding cylindrical donjon in Britain. But William Marshal seems not to have built any others. The cylindrical great towers at Usk and Kilkenny were in contrast defensible tours mixtes, attached to the curtain as at Chinon. And interestingly, Marshal was recorded at Chinon throughout August 1201, when the Tour du Moulin was probably under construction. The towers at Usk and Kilkenny don't appear to have been residential, like the French Tour philippienne, and unlike them, are not isolated by ditches. The garrison tower at Usk, which occupies an angle rather than a corner, is thought to have been built 1213 to 1219. The corbel parapet is a later addition. Marshal began work at Kilkenny, his Irish capital, rather earlier, in around 1208. And the Great Tower, the White Tower as it's known, was probably one of the first things to be built. Its immensely thick walling is almost unique, almost as it's shared by Dublin's Record Tower, which, though it might have been commissioned by King John in 1204, may not actually have been begun until around 1213. So who was copying who? At present, it's uncertain. So, did any of Marshal's influences come from the French royal court? Well, he certainly appears to have shown little real interest in his British estates. Up until its loss by King John in 1204, Marshal preferred to reside in Normandy, where he held the substantial lordships of Longueville and Orbec-Bienfait. But the records suggest that the only French castles that he can possibly have seen were built before designs like the Tour Philippienne took hold. Marshal is recorded in the French royal domain just 4 times after King Philip's succession in 1180. And all these visits were short, very limited in scope, and appear not to have encompassed any castles where new work was underway. Otherwise, the almost continuous warfare between France and Britain during the later 1190s put a hold on any contact with Philip's court, and would almost certainly prevented Marshal from recruiting any French royal masons. Instead, what this warfare did provide was the chance for Marshal to witness building work at many French castles of the English king. He frequently visited Chateau Gaillard while it was going up, and was at Fréteval in 1194, at Bonneville-sur-Touques in 1200, and possibly at Châtillon-sur-Indre in 1188. In other words, these were the great round towers that he'd seen before he began work on his own. And though he was allowed to keep his Norman estates after the loss of Normandy in 1204, the only Anglo-Norman who received that privilege, he never actually saw them again. He did visit the French king 3 more times as an envoy of King John, but his movements were naturally restricted, while he didn't visit any of Philip's new castles. And there are certain family relationships between Pembroke and the Angevin round towers. Absent from both is the vaulting that's pretty much ubiquitous in French work. And where vaulting does occur in Angevin donjons, it's plain barrel vaulting without ribs, and normally confined to basement level. Again, unlike France. And while nothing quite like Pembroke's high stone dome exists anywhere else in Britain or France, it may be derived from timber predecessors that are suggested by the ring of corbels in the round donjons at Conisbrough and Chateau Gaillard. Also following Conisbrough example is the large twin light window over the main entry. While the 2 of them are among the very few circular donjons to contain 4 stories. Conisbrough was built around 1180, Chateau Gaillard in 1196 to 98, and Pembroke between 1201 and 1207. And there may in fact be enough similarities between them to suggest that designers from the same Angevin tradition in northern France were at work at all 3. Pembroke's domes certainly points to someone with experience of similar domes in Anjou itself. For instance, in the important royal abbey at Fontevraud, where Kings Henry II and Richard were buried. Masons from Anjou in France were recorded in Britain after the loss of these territories in 1204. Meanwhile, the design of Pembroke's windows is reflected in a number of Angevin castles, like Chateau Gaillard, which we've seen, and these 2, but with variations, like the pointed arches, which had been used in the slightly earlier donjon at Chambois in Normandy. Chambois was built by Marshal in 1200, and the carved stone heads over the windows in its donjon were undoubtedly the source for the similar heads at Pembroke. Both here and here. But Pembroke's donjon also shows features that suggest masons from the English West Country were also at work, like the use of dogtooth ornament in the window surround, which is also used by Marshal at Usk. The West Country is where most of Marshal's estates lay, and was also the source of the dressed stone used at Pembroke. Dogtooth is nevertheless absent from the upper window of the donjon, so it may be that masons from France only arrived in person after the Angevin lands there had been lost to the French in 1204. But in time to contribute to the detail in the donjon's upper floors and its dome. Over the next 30 years, the circular donjon was adopted in a number of baronial castles in Wales. But strangely, it was never used elsewhere in Pembrokeshire. Nevertheless, Marshal castles gave rise to a distinct architectural style in West Wales that was to be highly influential for over 50 years. And while French royal influence has been claimed for many of its characteristics, all of them are seen, singly or together, in towers of the Angevin kings. For instance, Marshal's garrison tower at Usk and the towers built by his sons at Kilgarran and Pembroke, the dungeon tower, are circular in plan, recurving strongly into the curtain wall. It's a very sharp angle, a shape that's normally confined to corner towers. Interval towers on straight stretches of curtain wall normally tend to be D-shaped with flat backs. But circular interval towers like this were built by King Richard at Chateau Gaillard, by King John at Arc-la-Bataille and Bonneville, and Limerick, as well as by Angevin barons at, for instance, Brosse in Poitou. Philip of France, on the other hand, showed a preference for D-shaped interval towers, as did his barons. Also characteristic of Marshal towers is their pronounced entasis. That is, they can show a strongly bulging outline. You can see it particularly at Kilgarran, a sort of slightly globular outline. But this too occurs in Angevin work. For instance, in King John's towers at Arc-la-Bataille in Normandy. But it's in direct contrast to the regularity favoured by the French court. It was adopted elsewhere in West Wales, for instance at Kidwelly during the 1270s. The Marshals also employed the semicircular headed openings, which can feature in later Angevin work at castles like Arc, Bonneville-sur-Touques, Chateau Gaillard, and Gisors, and at Dover and Rochester in Kent. And Marshal castles employ a feature that was unknown in castles of the French king or his followers: enlarged oilets at the base of the arrow loops, as seen at Pembroke, Chepstow, Usk and Caerleon. Now considered to be visual embellishments, the same type of oilet could be adopted across peer groups as a sign of affinity or homage. But they were not used by the French at this time. Another Marshal feature, often considered to follow French precedent, is the very narrow arrow loop embrasure, wedge-shaped in plan and without the niches or casements more typical of Angevin embrasures. But while the Angevin kings definitely favoured the niche, they also used these narrow embrasures in some of their works. In their Normandy castles at Bonneville-sur-Touques, Gisors and Arc-la-Bataille, and also, for example, at Dover and Limerick in Ireland. An interesting feature of Marshal's work at Pembroke and Usk are the large square latrine turrets. Though a feature of monasteries and some manor houses, square latrine blocks like this were, at this time, unusual in British castles. But they had appeared in Angevin castles in France, like Chateau Gaillard, Chinon, and Falaise. Well, again, they are not seen in the French King Philip's castle. None of which is to deny that certain idiosyncrasies can be seen in Marshal work by both father and sons. They include the asymmetry with eccentric interiors of their towers at Kilgarran and Chepstow, and probably the South Tower at Usk. Like entasis, it was adopted elsewhere in West Wales. But none of these features appear in the French King Philip's castles, instead contrasting markedly with this preferred regularity. This preferred regularity extended to Philip's overall castle design. His castles are noted for their rectilinear geometric plans, the signature layout being a regular rectangular enclosure with round corner towers, one of which could be a tour philippienne, and D-shaped interval towers, and a twin tower gatehouse. This layout was used at Philip's Paris HQ, the Louvre, during the early 1190s, a time when most castles in the West still comprised irregular enclosures, often oval or sub-oval. But King Philip's castles weren't the earliest castles in Western Europe to show a geometric plan. It had already been used, probably during the 1170s, at Dreux-la-Belle-Fontaine in Burgundy, which was held by Philip's cousin, Peter de Courtenay. It may have been influential on the French king. In fact, both King Philip and King Richard I were entertained by Peter de Courtenay in 1190 at Vézelay Abbey, nearby, during the Great Crusader Conference there. And de Courtenay's pioneering layout, quadrangular with circular corner towers, was employed at two castles in France by King Richard. Montreuil-Bonnin in Poitou and Moulinault in Normandy. Moulinault was begun in 1195 and is thus broadly contemporary with King Philip's castle at the Louvre. But Montreuil-Bonnin might be earlier still, as French archaeologist Marie-Pierre Baudry has suggested that Richard might have built it during the 1180s. That is, before King Philip began work at the Louvre in 1190, as Richard was recorded as fortifying his castles in Poitou in 1187, during his tenure as Count of Poitou. So, both kings were following more general trends. And it's worth mentioning that the earliest rounded interval towers are Henry II's work of the 1160s to 80s, including at Loches in Touraine, here rather small, like those at Montreuil-Bonnin, and at Gisors and Rouen in Normandy. This isn't really the place to discuss whether any of this planning owes a debt to the Middle East, but it predates the adoption of the rounded tower into Crusader design, and current thinking is that it's more likely to have been influenced by late Roman remains. King Richard was one of the busier castles of the medieval world, although famously not so in Britain. In Normandy alone, he spent huge amounts at numerous castles. Only two account rolls survive, but they record spending of over £18,500 in those 2 years alone, which makes an interesting comparison with the total outlay of £6,500 over 9 years by Henry II on his massive undertaking at Dover. But apart from Chateau Gaillard, much of Richard's work is lost, altered, or unrecognized, leaving just a flavor of his designs. Richard spent freely at Moulinault and Pont de l'Arche in Normandy, both of which are said to have been deliberately dismantled in 1204, along with nearby Montfort-sur-Risle, to deny them to King Philip. So it was thought that Moulinault, as it exists, must therefore be the French king's work. But were these castles really dismantled? Montfort, for example, retains its earlier donjon and curtain wall. And Moulinault has now been acknowledged as not characteristically Philippian. In plan, it's rectangular rather than square, like Montreuil-Bonnin. A D-shaped interval tower contains a postern entered through the nose, like Angevin gate towers elsewhere. And one corner tower is square internally, as at Henry II's Gisors, which, like Moulinault, also shows these pentagonal tower-fronted towers, and a relationship with the Bic donjon at Chateau Gaillard is conceivable. The geometric castle formerly at Pont de l'Arche may also have been Richard's work. although a compelling argument has recently been made by Jean Mesky and Denis Héault for King Philip's hand. But this kind of regular planning took some time to catch on in the Angevin territories. Two castles illustrate the point. The Coudray-Salbart in Poitou is well known for its geometric layout. It was begun under royal subsidy early in King John's reign, around 1202. But recent investigation showed that it only achieved its regular symmetrical plan through gradual enlargement between 1210 and 1240. This plan shows the earliest and latest phases. Ditto Dublin, another castle of King John's, which was built incrementally over a 25-year period from 1204 onwards, but only became rectilinear between 1213 and 1230. And geometric design was equally slow to be adopted by Angevin barons. For instance, while William Marshal's castle at Kilkenny appears to show a near rectilinear plan, its walls, in fact, follow the line of the 12th century earthwork enclosure on which it was built. And the outwardly rectangular plan of the inner ward at Usk is often compared with the Coudray-Salbart. But while William Marshal's curtain wall might appear to form a rectangular plan, it is in fact a sub-oval, defined by 10 straight lengths of walling, and incorporates a pre-existing gate tower, so again represents an earlier enclosure. But Marshal may have been responsible for an early rectangular plan at another British castle, at Goodrich. The present late 13th century castle is a square enclosure with circular corner towers, but it overlies the patchy remains of an earlier castle that seems to follow much the same plan, shown in green here, including a round corner tower, and which was built around a pre-existing square donjon. This may have been begun by Marshal, following a Welsh attack in 1216. He was recorded at the castle in 1217 and 1218, perhaps checking on the progress of work. But it's possible, perhaps more likely in fact, that it was built by his son Walter, maybe in the 1240s, as Goodrich was his main residence, and for a long time, his only residence. Skenfrith in Monmouthshire, another baronial castle, is possibly contemporary. But this time, we can be more confident about the dates. It was almost certainly built between 1219 and 1232, making it the earliest surviving fully geometric castle in Britain and Ireland that can be securely dated. It's concentric around a central round donjon, echoing Montreuil-Bonat in Poitou, which may be significant, as Skenfrith's builder, Hubert de Burgh, had been Seneschal of Poitou from 1212 to 1215. And its trapezoid plan and disposition of towers also recall phase one at Coudray-Salbart, also in de Burgh's Poitou. Moving on to castle gateways. Well, gateways under William Marshal and his sons show a variety of arrangements, but they're generally rather simple. The middle gate at Chepstow is a simple archway without a portcullis. It's Franco-Angevin transitional Gothic detail, including the imposts. Closely resembles that of the Porte Saint-Nicolas at Falaise in Normandy, which was built by Henry II or Richard I in the 1180s or 90s. So it might have been begun soon after Marshal left Normandy in late 1203. The upper gate at Chepstow is another simple archway without a portcullis, but it shows a very pronounced, deeply rebated double chamfer, which is absent from the middle gate. And it lacks the latter's imposts, the chamfers instead being continuous through the jambs in the head. It may be somewhat later, an influence from closer to home. Rebated double chamfers, like this, seem to have their origins in the so-called West Country school of masons. This school was most notably active at Glastonbury Abbey and Wells Cathedral, but also, and perhaps significantly, at Llantony Priory in Monmouthshire. Work from the 1180s and 90s at all three includes the rebated double chamfer. And as in Chepstow's upper gate, the mouldings are continuous, something of a signature motif of the school. The school was highly influential, an influence that even reached the royal workshops, and at an early date. King John's Gloriette at Corfe Castle in Dorset, a palatial complex of domestic buildings, was built between 1202 and 1205, and the rebated double chamfer is dominant. It is used alongside another innovation, the near triangular segmental pointed arch. So, along with Llantony perhaps, Corfe may have been the model at William Marshall's Chepstow. And adjoining the upper gate at Chepstow is a contemporary square tower, which shows the same kind of triangular arch, though here without chamfers. Tower and gate are both thought to belong to a late period of Marshall's career, perhaps between 1213 and 1219. Multiple rebated chamfers used with the triangular arch were to become defining features of castles on the Welsh border in the later 13th century. Think of Goodrich. We see something similar in the main entry at Usk. The outer arch has gone, but may have been chamfered, like its jambs. The surviving inner arch, while plain externally, has a pronounced chamfer internally. It might be tempting to see this gateway as roughly contemporary with Chepstow's upper gate. But unlike Chepstow, it had a portcullis, while the portcullis grooves were rounded, not in profile, not square, in a manner which is thought to have developed during the 1230s and 40s. This may suggest the gate was instead built by Marshal's son Gilbert during the late 1230s. The chamfer stops are barred and also slightly cushioned. Can't really see it that clearly, but they are not quite bald, but cushioned. Again, implying a date somewhat further into the 13th century. The main gate at Marshal Kilgarran, probably also from the 1230s, was a simple square tower of a kind that had been built for well over 100 years. Yet it shows two portcullis grooves, here and those two, here and here. This time they're square in profile, but this may be more to do with the local shale they're made from. Little remains of the similar gate tower at the Marshal's Tenby Castle. It's not unlike Kilgarran's in general form, but much smaller and with only one portcullis. But the elder Marshal's career coincided with a period of rapid gatehouse development, culminating in the familiar twin tower form with round towers, but encompassing a wide variety of other forms on the way. Richard I's entries at Moulins, Avrilly, and Radepont in Normandy, and King John's Coudray-Salbar were D-shaped towers, entered through the nose and housing straight passages. Radepont's gate, in particular, and perhaps Coudray's, may be behind Hubert de Burgh's choice of a similar, if larger, gate tower at Grosmont in Monmouthshire, built 1219 to 32. And Grosmont was conceivably the source for the D-shaped gate tower at Dunamere Castle in Ireland, built by William Marshal II, as he was a close ally of de Burgh until 1226. A variation on this design was circular in plan, like the South Gatehouse at King John's Arc la Bataille. This form was also chosen for St John's Tower at Dover Castle, built 1217 to 21, and the later gatehouse at Coudray-Salbar, and was also adopted in Ireland. A further variation was a D-shaped tower entered through the flank, like William Marshall's massive inner gate tower at Pembroke, which was probably built between 1204 and 1207 and lacked portcullis. Gate towers incorporating a 90-degree turn like this, or bent entrances, are characteristic of the Islamic Mediterranean and Middle East, and were adopted by the Crusaders. So could we be seeing evidence for at least some Crusader influence in the West? Marshal did visit Palestine in 1184-6, but while he may have spent time with the Templars, our only source for this visit is silent about his movements there. But these Middle Eastern gate towers, like other towers there, are square in plan. Plus, the Pembroke Gate was built a full 20 years after Marshal's return. It may, in fact, be that Richard I was again the influence. The inner gate tower at Saranda Colonna's castle, near Paphos on Cyprus, is a similar D-shaped bent entry. Cyprus was briefly held by King Richard in 1191. And while the present castle is thought by some to be a little later, built by the Lusinians, kings of Jerusalem and Cyprus between 1194 and 1204, others have suggested that much of it is actually earlier, and Byzantine. But the outer ward in particular shows some attributes that are more characteristic of Angevin design, including the use of hollow, proud interval towers, like those we saw at Moulins and Guizot in Normandy. It also has a Western-style spiral stair and corner towers that are both round and polygonal, as in Angevin work at Dover and elsewhere. In fact, in overall form, the outer ward is not unlike Richard's Montreuil-Bonnin. You can see the resemblance here with the removal of the inner ward. The inner ward is of a very different form, and apart from its D-shaped bent entrance, is more typically Byzantine in style, or Crusader, with square corner towers. So is it possible that the outer ward as we see it today, and the inner ward bent entrance, were begun by King Richard during his brief tenure in 1191? It may be significant the outer ward seems to have been left unfinished. And it's concentric around the inner ward. So it's worth stressing that a concentric plan had been used at Dover by Richard's father, Henry II. And the bent entry, like Pembroke's, is similar in overall form to the D-shaped mural towers at Henry II's Guizot. So might it be a Western adaptation under Richard of an Eastern gateway design? A connection with the king might explain Marshal's adoption of the design. I'm very happy to admit that all this is highly speculative, and the Middle Eastern specialist I've been talking to is far from convinced. But even if Saranda Colonna's was of Lusignan build, King Richard may still provide a link with Pembroke, as Geoffrey de Lusignan and Marshal were both in his retinue, 1196 to 99. Entry towers like this are very rare in the West. There's one at Royal Montgomery, which may confirm it was an Angevin design. But it might be significant that this one was built under the direction of Hubert de Burgh during the 1220s. And we've noted his close relationship with William Marshal's son, William the Younger, who, moreover, was active in Montgomery's administration, being responsible for collecting scutage, while his clerk, Peter of Luton, dispersed payments for works on the castle in 1224-5. Another at Caldecott Castle in Monmouthshire probably results from direct Marshal influence from nearby Chepstow, and is a bit later, maybe 1240s. The other two lie much further north, at Barnard Castle and Sandal Castle in Yorkshire. Familial links between the Marshals and Sandal exist, but maybe stretching things a bit, as these northern gates are both probably later 13th century. Excuse me. So far, we've been looking at fairly simple gates. Chepstow's main gatehouse, on the other hand, is a substantial twin tower structure. But when was it built and by whom? Famously, its timber doors survive, and dendro analysis yielded a felling date between 1159 and 1189, when Marshal first received the castle, and the timbers have not apparently been reused. But was the entrance arch they occupied the same date as the round towers that flank it? The gatehouse is clearly not of one build, and the entrance passage went through a lot of alteration later in the 13th century, when chambers were also added to the rear. One suggestion that's been made is that the archway and gates might belong to an earlier square gate tower, subsumed within the present gatehouse, and now represented by the passage sidewalls. And the unusual protrusion of the spiral stair shaft into the interior of one of the flanking towers is mirrored at younger Marshal Pembroke in Kilgarran. While the arrow loops in these towers are cruciform, which is also more characteristic of William Marshal's sons. And the circular oilets here is characteristic of younger Marshal work at Chepstow itself. One tower is slightly larger than the other, which is thought to be a kind of Marshal trademark. But it's also seen with an Angevin milieu from the 1190s onwards. For example, in the gate recently excavated at Vaudreuil in Normandy, which was probably begun by Richard I in 1195, and also in the contemporary inner gate at his tenant lord's Abridi Castle at King John's Limerick from around 1211 to 12, and Carmarthen, built by the younger Marshals or Hubert de Burgh in the 1220s or 30s, but later rebuilt on the same footprint. But the elder Marshal does seem to have built twin-towered gatehouses. There's one at his main centre in Normandy, the castle at Longueville-sur-Sea, near Dieppe. But unlike Chepstow, it has solid towers, as in Richard I's castles at Vaudreuil and Montreuil-Bonnin, and the Porte des Champs at Angevin Falaise. And the gate towers are possibly buttressed, again like Vaudreuil, which we know Marshal visited in 1199. In addition, it lacks a portcullis, so overall would fit in very nicely with the date between 1194 and 1203, when Marshal was mainly resident in Normandy. But the gatehouse recently excavated at William Marshal's Kilkenny is hollow tower, and appears to belong to an early phase of work there, although the castle hasn't been fully excavated, and dates still have to remain uncertain. One tower occupies a corner and is round, while the other is more D-shaped, like Henry III's later gatehouses at Corfe and the Tower of London. Either way, hollow rounded towers, like their solid counterparts, had firm Angevin precedent. In the Porte Saint-Nicolas at Falaise, built by Henry II or Richard, and visited by Marshal in 1203, the towers are D-shaped with open backs. The northwest gate at Dover, the Norfolk Towers, is similar, and was probably built by King John between 1208 and 1215. So, in form and detail, William Marshal's castles reference those of the Angevin kings, Henry II, Richard, and John. He owed everything to his royal patrons, and this emulation was undoubtedly deliberate, identifying him as a leading and loyal subject. Because if one thing really comes through in Marshal's life story, it's his constant insistence on his loyalty to the Angevin crown. What better way to express that loyalty, be it genuine or a bit of a front, than to emulate the king's buildings? And it may even have taken in the use of crown masons. Marshal's links with the French court, on the other hand, were of much lesser magnitude, and politically something to be played down. While there is persuasive evidence neither for influence from King Philip's works, nor of a mechanism through which it could be transmitted. But the relative dating of the great towers at Dublin and Kilkenny is uncertain, raising the possibility that the influence might sometimes flow both ways. It may be significant that King John stayed at Kidwelly in 1210 on his punitive visit to Ireland. Or perhaps the same master was engaged at both castles. It's also worth pointing out that it was Marshal who oversaw the works at Royal Arques-la-Bataille in 1202. And how did transmission of these influences really work in practice? How were they disseminated and by whom? The speed with which ideas were communicated during the 13th century testifies to the existence of a close network of professionals, within which the exchange of patterns or drawings, often suggested but rarely surviving, may not have been necessary. What occasionally do survive, however, are contracts between patron and master mason, which can include instructions to build copies of specific buildings at other castles, showing that masons and their clients were well aware of each other's works. So we can envisage a more direct interplay between master masons, in which trends could be rapidly disseminated. Masons could travel widely, undertaking varied projects for varied patrons, bringing them to personal contact with other masons and influences. And we've seen that masons from Angers in France were employed in Britain. But patrons could themselves sometimes be responsible for overall castle design as well, even if their influence upon actual execution was necessarily more restricted. Richard I, for example, is thought personally to lie behind the design at Chateau Gaillard. But as we've seen, more commonplace was the exercise of patronal choice. And I've noted the amount of time Marshal spent around royal castles. The family relationship between their castles suggests that the Marshals, one way or another, lay behind the architectural style of much of their building work. In this way, patrons could be responsible for dissemination, not only of individual features, but entire styles. But that's a whole new topic. And for now, I think my time is up.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Neil. I'll just stop the recording there.